Hi friends, I am Naavi of Naavi Academy. Today on 30th of October 2024, we will be taking up a very interesting point for discussion related to DPDPA. DGPSI is the framework which we are recommending for the purpose of compliance of DPDPA. And many times I have been saying that DGPSI is the only alternative available for organizations for implementation of DPDPA because DGPSI is like the data fiduciary concept. That is, DPDPA thinks that a data fiduciary is a person who, being called a fiduciary, is actually expected to take care of the interests of the data principal, even beyond the consent contract. That is what Section 8 of DPDPA says. Similarly, when we present DGPSI as a framework for implementation of DPDPA, we consider that there is a responsibility on our part to ensure that the user of the DGPSI framework is, to the best possible extent, remains compliant with DPDPA. That is why we consider DGPSI as a very important development in India as far as the compliance of data protection laws is concerned. We will perhaps go into the details of DGPSI separately in other videos, but today I would like to discuss one very important aspect of any data processing transaction. Normally, a data processing transaction starts with one of the entities which is collecting the personal data from the data principal. And at that time, the collector is expected to inform the data principal about the purpose of collection in the form of a notice. So when the data principal gives a confirmation of the notice, that becomes a consent contract. So there is a privity of contract between the data principal and the data collector. And that is the place where the purpose of collection, what kind of data is required for that particular process, how long they will be retained, etc., will all be informed to the data principal, and he gives an informed consent. Now, having collected that information, now this collector has to decide how he has to process the data to fulfill the purpose for which he has collected the information. Now, he may process it himself, or for certain aspects of processing which he has decided as the purpose, he may engage the services of another person. Normally, we identify, let us say in the GDPR context, the person who has collected as the data controller and the person who is processing as the data processor. Now, in between them, there is a data processing contract. And GDPR has suggested various kinds of standard contractual clauses which have to be incorporated there. Now, in the DPDPA context, we are talking of the so-called data controller as a data fiduciary. When we use the word fiduciary, it means that they have to take responsibility for the benefit of the data principal, irrespective of whatever has been mentioned in the contract. Therefore, if the permission request, which is there as a part of the notice, is unclear to the data principal, the responsibility of making it clear falls on the data fiduciary. Now, having collected that, if the data processor says, you give me the purpose of processing. I will do it in my own way. I will not tell you how I am going to process it, but I will do it in a manner in which your purpose will be served. In that context, the means of processing is completely controlled by the second person. So the second person who holds the means of contract and takes responsibility for that, either because that is his proprietary knowledge, etc., must accept that he is a joint data fiduciary. So the first person who collects the data is the main data fiduciary, and the second person is a joint data fiduciary. And as a joint data fiduciary, he is responsible for DPDPA as much as the first person, though the responsibilities between them have to be compartmentalized, until the data was handed over to the second data fiduciary, and subsequent responsibility becomes his. And after the process is over, the contract may say that the data will be deleted by the joint data fiduciary and returned back to the data fiduciary. Now, those are terms of the contract. Now, the question arises that the data fiduciary is a business entity. The joint data fiduciary is also a business entity. So, the transaction between them is not one between the data principal and the data fiduciary. It is between one data fiduciary and another data fiduciary. So the first data fiduciary, while taking the consent, has assumed responsibility for the property of the data principal, and he becomes the owner of the personal data of all his data principals. Now that is what he is handing over to the joint data fiduciary and giving a certain instructions of how it has to be processed, or telling him that you are a joint data fiduciary, you know how to process it, and therefore please process it for meeting my purpose, and then return the processed data to me, and afterwards all the raw data please destroy. And even if he doesn't say so, the second person, who is a joint data fiduciary, knows that the data was handed over to him for a purpose, and after the purpose is over and the processed data is handed over back to the first data fiduciary, as a joint data fiduciary, it is his duty to actually delete all the data, because the purpose is over. There is no need for keeping it further. Unless, of course, by a separate contract, they establish a legal requirement for holding it for a certain additional period, for example, for settlement of the bills and other things. Okay, I may process the data during the month, and end of the month I may be putting up the bill, and it may take 2 months for me to recover the monies. Thereafter, there may be tax considerations for which I may have to retain some information. So though the data itself would have served its purpose once the processing is over, maybe until the bill is settled, there is a need to have an evidence of how many data was processed, and subsequently the entire data becomes redundant, and only the invoice becomes the data which can be taken for archival subsequently. So this second data handler, who is a joint data fiduciary, has the responsibility for managing the data after it was handed over to him. Now, if this is a business-to-business transaction, can the second data handler claim that I am not doing any transaction directly with any data principal? My transaction is limited to the business transaction with the first data fiduciary. Therefore, I am not processing personal data for which DPDPA is applicable. Therefore, I am not to be considered as a joint data fiduciary, or a person responsible for certain other aspects of the data DPDPA. And in case there is a leak or something like that, the responsibility is I have to ensure that I must say that I am not fully responsible for that. Now, is he right in taking that stand? Now, we have to also remember that when the first data fiduciary transfers the data to the second person, he has the ability to pseudonymize the data before handing it over to the second person without telling him that it is pseudonymized data. He can tell, probably he should tell as a ethical disclosure, but he has the option. So therefore, the second person may say that I am only a business processor and I am dealing with the pseudonymized data. Or in my contract, I will insist that the first data fiduciary should send me only pseudonymized data. I am not wanting to hold the real data. And therefore, I should not be considered as a joint data fiduciary. I have to be considered as a processor, even if I am not giving you the means of processing, because the means of processing I am adopting is for a non-personal data. If we take this argument, we are coming to a very important thought process where whenever personal data is transferred from one processor to another processor, it is the responsibility of the first processor to pseudonymize the data and never ever transfer personal data without pseudonymization. And if he does so, then he is voluntarily taking the responsibility. So probably we have to develop a jurisprudence in regard to the data fiduciary and the data processor transactions to state that the second person will be considered joint data fiduciary if the first person has disclosed that he is transferring the identifiable personal data to the second person and he is not aware of the means of processing. Therefore, he should consider the second person as a joint data fiduciary, in which case the second person who wants to process only the identifiable data and who wants to have control on the means of processing has to accept that he is a joint data fiduciary. However, if the two agree that the data fiduciary, first data fiduciary pseudonymizes the data in such a manner that the data which goes into the second processor is only pseudonymized data, and therefore the data is considered as not coming within the provisions of DPDPA, though it may come under Section 72A of Information Technology Act, even as a pseudonymized data. This contract will establish that the second data fiduciary does not have the responsibility as a joint data fiduciary, but he can remain a data processor. I think this requires a lot more thinking. I am just placing this for further debate. I hope you will look at this in depth and give me back your comments. Thank you.